Welcome back. This is our 8th show in a series of shows entitled Rehabilitation Coming Soon, where we have been discussing the mass incarceration practices of the United States and the effect of those practices on the state of Hawaii. I am Aaron Wills, a William S. Richardson Law School graduate and a consultant for retired Judge Mike Towns' private mediation practice. Over the last 7 weeks, we have heard from people in the community who see the problem of mass incarceration from different perspectives. Our first guest was Bob Merce, who talked about a very successful Norwegian correctional system and the profound differences between the regional system and our system. Dr. Mita Chesley Lind was our second guest, and she discussed mass incarceration from the perspective of a criminologist. Stephen Morse and Shane Kukuna Okala from Blueprint for Change talked about the effects of mass incarceration on the family. Susan Arnett gave us perspectives of a public defender, and Mark Patterson talked about addressing the problems of juvenile offenders. We had Judge Mark Browning on the show, and he talked about the juvenile justice system and the effects of trauma on juvenile offenders. And last week, we heard from a defense attorney's perspective with Miles Briner. Today, we'd like to hear about community efforts, where public-private faith-based organizations, supporters, families, and justice-involved peers are working together to be part of the solution and making a collective impact with Toni Bissen. Our guest, Toni Bissen, is the executive director of the Pu'a Foundation, a charitable organization that was established in 1996 as a result of the apology, redress, and reconciliation between the Native Hawaiian people and the United Church of Christ for the church's complicity involved with the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian constitutional monarchy. The foundation's vision is that through Pu'a, the process of feeding, nourishing, and strengthening, there will be the emergence of empowered, enlightened communities and society. Its aspiration is community healing and well-being to reconcile the past with the present so that as Hawaii community, together we can build a better future. Toni holds a Juris Doctorate from the DC School of Law, now the University of District of Columbia in Washington, DC. She has worked for various nonprofit organizations and in private practice. Toni is also on the Reentry Commission that is placed within the Department of Public Safety to work with the Department of Public Safety to monitor and review the comprehensive offender reentry program, including facility education, treatment programs, rehabilitative services, work furloughs, HPA oversight of the parolees. It has 10 members, including a director, 9 of whom serve on a volunteer basis. Welcome, Toni, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, I know that you and Mark Patterson wrote an article together, and it was entitled "Can Prison Be a Place of Healing?" Is that correct?
Yep.
All right. So we're gonna stick to a subject kind of surrounding that idea. And the first thing I just wanted to ask you is, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the Pu'a Foundation, when it was created and why it was created and the work it kind of does. I know that's kind of a loaded question.
Sure. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Pu'a Foundation. Your introduction was a great way to start us off. And essentially what the foundation does, we were founded in 1993. There was an apology, redress, and reconciliation initiative on the part of the United Church of Christ concerning the overthrow. Mm-hmm. So there was a long process to really talk about historical and social justice issues, and our foundation was created out of a larger plan. So what we focus on at the foundation is, when we talk about community healing and well-being, it is an issue of understanding historical trauma, community trauma, individual trauma, and how we transform to get to a place of healing. And so the work that we've done associated with the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, in terms of how can prison be a place of healing, how can family court be a better place of healing, mm-hmm. It is really understanding trauma and how it affects those who are incarcerated, and how we as a community can really organize and be part of that solution. I think this show is addressing issues of mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. And so over the last 20 years or so, understanding the effects of trauma and how it has really fed into the criminal justice system and incarceration is something that I'm really passionate to try and address, mm-hmm. for our community's sake, for our family's sake, and just to have a bigger and better and stronger community.
Well, on that community issue, does the Pu'a Foundation partner with other community resources, and is forming community partnerships an important or integral part of what the Pu'a Foundation does?
Absolutely. At the Pu'a Foundation, we talk about transforming lives, and we really talk about how we are community organizing, providing capacity building and training and leading initiatives that are innovative and focusing on trying to address these issues of historical, community, and individual trauma. But how we do it, we have a framework that came out of the work we've done at the Women's Community Correctional Center, as well as Family Court and the Office for Youth Services. And that model is a Pu'a Creating Places of Healing model, which we'll talk about. But part of all of that model and framework is to be able to organize our community and identify time, talents, and treasures, and also identifying people's personal gifts, professional gifts, and organizational gifts as it relates to being part of the solution to service our community and bring more resources to government that is really dealing with this incarceration issue. So community partnerships and forming partnerships is critical and key to the work that we all do at the Pu'a Foundation and in the community.
Okay, and I believe we have a graphic. I believe it's graphic number 1. And this is the framework for the model and framework for the
Yes.
Pu'a Foundation. Could you talk us through this a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. How do you like the colors?
Oh, they're great. It's
vibrant.
It's an awesome display there.
So what this is, we do a lot of training about this. So the Pu'a Creating Places of Healing model and framework is really about how we can develop sanctuaries, places of transformation, which is an overarching aspiration. But we break this graphic down into 3 types of areas. The first area that you notice in pink talks about the overarching context, the contextual parts of this framework. And it talks about, what does that mean? It talks about really, what is the context upon which we are talking about? What are we doing? And so we're looking at the criminal justice system and beyond. We're looking at systemic change and collective impact. And we're also looking at developing community building and forming partnerships. So that's the context in which the Pu'a is being offered. Can prison be a place of healing? What kind of context are we talking about? We're talking about those 3 areas. Okay. The 4 component parts that are in blue is the breakdown of the HALE, we like to call it, the Trauma-Informed Care Framework. It has 4 component parts to it. Understanding what a Pu'a is, a place of sanctuary, is the first part. And the second part is understanding trauma-informed care framework, understanding trauma. Right. And then within that framework, we have things that we talk about in terms of mind, body, spirit, and place, which is the holistic person and the holistic person's journey to healing. And lastly, we talk about space. Can we develop a space for healing? But SPACE is an acronym for staff, programs, administration, community, and environment. So it's that kind of different component parts to that. But could we just go over one more part if we could?
Yeah, no
and
problem.
the second part, and this is the systemic part. So number 2 in green, it talks about 2 things. It talks about the systemic framework. And you look at the bottom graphic, it has BAT, and there is a graphic of a carriage, a baby carriage, and an elderly person. So the last part of this framework and model talks about the systemic framework. It talks about taking a bat to the system, that all parts of the system, tend to work in silos. And so you're looking at the continuum of care, which talks a little bit about from the beginning, from twinkle to wrinkle, but it's kind of a behavioral health kind of continuum, but it provides the framework to understand what happens before incarceration, prevention, what happens at a facility, intervention, and what happens in transition. Okay. Can I share one more point with
absolutely.
this? And at the bottom of the framework itself, it talks about a public-private funding collaborative model. So the 2 systemic framework parts talks about understanding the continuum and before, at, and transition, but also provides a mechanism in which we can encourage partnerships by sharing resources, by sharing data, but also by sharing and tearing down silos. So we encourage working together. So there's a framework or a model that we call a public-private funding collaborative model that we hope to be part of the solution.
And I believe we have a graphic for the public collaborative model. It's number 7. And just from reading about the Pu'a Foundation, that it follows a collaborative model in which there is a continuum of care. Could you explain what the collaborative model is to our viewers?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the fundamental part of understanding Pu'ahonua, or it is a place of healing. So if you think that the Women's Community Correctional Center can be a place of healing, a place to live a transformative life, and if we believe in that, one of the underlying ways in which it touches the system and how we can encourage different governmental organizations and reinvestment of public resources, as well as philanthropy and having the investments provided into an apparatus like the public-private funding collaborative model.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is that funding goes into an apparatus and it goes out into the various kinds of organizations, families, entities that are collaborating together,
Mm-hmm.
but we're sharing data and sharing resources. Because if what we talk about in terms of understanding trauma, understanding the pathway to prison, understanding how you're going to be effective at transforming to come back into community, we recognize that there is a prevention part, working with our families, with our schools, with our churches. Then there's a part that so that's the B, the intervention part. In the A section, it talks about what are we doing at facilities? What are we doing at the Women's Community Correctional Center? What are we doing at the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility? And then after that, what happens when folks transition back into community? So looking at it very systemically, looking at it very holistically, understanding about pu'onua, understanding about transformation, understanding trauma. But the public-private funding collaborative model really provides an apparatus to encourage people working together and trying to maintain a consistent common vision, common language, understanding the data, sharing the resources.
Okay, could we see graphic number 8, please? I believe it's a second part to this.
Yes.
And could you continue to kind
Sure.
of explain how this kind of ties
Absolutely. On the far right-hand side is the Pu'ahonua graphic itself, where it talks a little bit about understanding trauma, and it's supposed to be a hale. It's supposed to be a house.
Okay. Oh, I see.
In our
Okay.
drawing.
Mhm.
And so the framework of your house would be understanding trauma. And within your hale within your house, you're looking at the holistic person, and you have a mind, body, spirit, place perspective,
yeah.
and it's an individual's journey to healing and transformation. And within the hale itself, within the 4 parts, we talk about how we can create a space for that. So that's an acronym. On the far left hand of the graphic, how can you help? We're really looking at how we can garner resources to surround our families that have been affected by trauma, have been affected by incarceration, and how all of our time, talents, and treasures are organized to be able to surround our families. And it's every contribution can really provide an incredible impact. We like to call it Together We Can. It's a kako thing, collective impact, if you will. So that's some of the work we get to do.
All right. Well, we'll be right back with attorney and executive director Toni Bissen. My name is Aaron Wills, and this is Rehabilitation Coming Soon.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, citizen journalism from Hawaii, finding the intersection of our sense of place and our place in the world, right here at home. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
I'm Jay Fidel, and I'm the host of Research in Manoa, Mondays from 12 to 1 on thinktechhawaii.com. Take a look at us and learn about geophysics, learn about planetology, learn about the ocean and earth sciences at UH Manoa. You'll really enjoy it. So come around, we'll see you then.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host the show called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. We go beyond outrage to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I hope you will join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We broadcast live from thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and bye-bye.
Welcome back. I am Aaron Wills. This is Rehabilitation Coming Soon, and we're sitting here with our guest, Toni Bissen. Well, Toni, I just wanted, you spoke a lot about trauma-informed care, so I kind of want to get into what trauma-informed care is. Mark Patterson was on our show earlier, and he kind of explained a little bit what it was, and so this would be great to get your perspective. So if you could explain what trauma-informed care is and its significant in terms of correctional practices.
Sure. in a nutshell, understanding trauma, it's a system and an approach to dealing with certain kinds of mental health issues, behavioral health issues, and how it applies to incarceration is that over the years, there's been so many studies and research, and at the foundation, we've also did a study. We were part of a larger group that did a pilot study at the Women's Community Correctional Center and found that 100% of the people in our study were victims of trauma. And we understand that trauma is really the pathway to prison. And so understanding what happened. So in very concrete terms, understanding trauma and how to deal with it, there's a reason why we have a lot of drug addiction in our community, which leads to incarceration and criminal kinds of involvement. It's to mask the kind of pain that perhaps has happened in the home. So that kind of trauma, whether it be molestation or different kinds of things that have happened that are quite unfortunate, that have led some of our women, our men, our youth to be engaged in drug addiction. And as a result, end up in prison. So understanding or being trauma informed means that you understand trauma and you understand how to address that. We do a lot of work with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, and they have studied this material for many, many years and provided some wonderful tools in which communities can utilize their expertise in the community with those who are affected by incarceration at the Women's Community Correctional Center with families. And they've broken it down in terms of understanding general principles. And I'll share really quickly 6 major principles that are part of a trauma-informed approach. And they are: you create safety, you create trust and transparency, you create peer support, which is an important part of understanding trauma and being a part of the solution. You understand to be empowerment, voice and choice, providing those that you serve with a voice and with a choice. We also talk a little bit about historical, gender, and cultural issues that are extremely important in understanding trauma. So some of these different approaches that make up trauma and how it really affects those that are incarcerated, it really is, as I see it, a way in which we can set up circumstances to heal. And it's not just understanding trauma, it has to be in an environment that explicitly talks about healing. So it's understanding trauma, but providing the space for healing itself. I've been working at the Women's Community Correctional Center, partnering and being on leadership teams there at the Hawaii Youth Correctional Center, working in the juvenile justice system with some of your past guests like Mark Patterson, like Judge Browning. And everybody talks about understanding what that trauma is and trying to heal that. So it's very integral in terms of understanding what that trauma is. And so as a system, we can be trauma informed. You can be trauma informed at a systems level, at a program level, at an organization level. So it's a wonderful tool in which we can all participate to bring about change and solutions to those we serve that are affected by incarceration and trauma.
Well, do you have any success stories as someone who maybe you've actually used trauma-informed care on?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. You know, it's complex. It's complex with respect to how a woman's pathway to prison, that's complex. And so simultaneously is that how you recover or how you heal is also complex. And being trauma-informed, providing a space for healing is a comprehensive approach in which we can encourage a healing journey. So I have been honored and blessed to work with many, many women who have suffered from trauma in a very real way and transformed. We talk about it in terms of trauma to transformation. And in terms of confidentiality and sharing stories, I have a colleague that works with me, and she was actually given a 40-year term. And she served 8 years in lockdown, which means that you are in a cell for 23 hours a day for 8 years. And she was part of the efforts that involved Pu'a, the Trauma-Informed Care Initiative. And I have seen miracles happen. She has transformed, she has healed, she has identified the trauma and overcome through many different programs at the facility itself, because at the BCCC, if we can say it is a place of healing, what happens there and how she transformed provides these different organizations, different programs come into a space where we can share our gifts so that we can assist and support women transforming from trauma to transformation.
Well, I believe we have a graphic. It's graphic number 3 about trauma, the basics of what trauma is. And I just wanted to know, what role does trauma play in the trajectory of an individual toward criminal behavior?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, this particular graphic is part of a curriculum that we've put together for the federal detention facility, and it's called a pre-transition course.
Okay.
And we also have the same course at the Women's Community Correctional Center. And the context here is to be able to assist some of our women who are transitioning from prison to community. We start by talking about what a pu'uhonua is, talking about the components of trauma, because in this class itself, we've broken it down that it's a 2-hour course, 12 weeks, and we hope it takes us from trauma to transformation. We hope it affects our women so that they are strong enough and feel confident in themselves to be successful when they transition out. Part of that is understanding the different components of trauma, how it relates to their life, and how we support them to move on to a healing journey and a successful journey that they will be part of. So these are just some of the, as I talked about, individual trauma, historical trauma, community trauma, are the kinds of traumas that are specifically identified and defined, and really the definition of recovery. So we talk a little bit about that, and I touched upon the 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach, and those are it. And what I didn't say at the last segment was that the 4th part is collaboration and mutuality. So we have a lot of different kinds of ways to understand trauma, to deal with recovery, and how it is being placed within a context that assists with reduction of mass incarceration. I personally hope that, and I personally believe that understanding trauma, working with community partners, faith-based, public, private organizations coming together to make a collective impact, and utilizing the framework of understanding trauma and the pu'uhonua, is we can bring the numbers down. We can reduce recidivism.
Well, and on that note, I just wanted to ask you, are these measures that we're discussing, is there any empirical evidence that proves that this stuff saves money and it actually reduces recidivism, or is this all just anecdotal?
Oh yeah, wow, that's a good question. Wow. Well, I guess in terms of, I'll give you one example. And the example usually is about evidence-based practices, evaluation, how we can measure these things. How can we measure cost savings? How can we measure saving lives through these kinds of different approaches? And I'll just point to one of the articles that we were part of, and that show Orange is the New Black?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
The creators, we a couple of years ago, they interviewed us. There was a New York Times article that was posted on the web that talked a little bit about being trauma-informed and also trying to be able to see how men and women are different in terms of gender responsiveness. So after this wonderful article came out, and it's still online, it talked about what is the model. And the model, as they looked at it, was what we were doing at WCCC. And the warden at the time, who was your guest here, Mark Patterson, said there was probably a reduction of a couple of percent reduction as a result of this new approach. And so there are some statistics locally that show this can be positive, that it can help the situation. It can help reduce incarceration, reduce recidivism, reduce reoffending. But my hope and my plea in terms of how we can work together to really have a better way in which we can evaluate this. And it's the partnerships that we can establish with the Department of Public Safety, with the Attorney General's Office, with the Hawaii Paroling Authority, and a larger context in which we can very much track what kinds of impact this has. Yeah, it's a complicated issue with respect to evidence-based practices, how do you measure it, and ultimately, how do you save money? How does the government save money?
Right. And ultimately, I mean, I don't know if people really look at this, but if people don't come back into prison, you're saving money because they're being successful. Right?
Absolutely.
So reducing the recidivism rate is a big deal.
Absolutely.
Mark Patterson talked about a Pu'a, and we know what that means. It means a place of refuge. But he talked about it in a context of it being in a prison context, that it can be in a prison context.
Correct.
I asked him, how do you take this Pu'a concept and actually apply it to a prison context? Well, what would your be idea? How would you take that? I mean, would it be a work site you would go to? Would you create a Pu'a at the prison?
Yeah, right. So thanks for the question. It's a great question. When we say, can prison be a place of healing, can it be a Pu'a? So the sanctuary itself is the facility itself.
Oh, okay.
So can prison be a place of healing? Can the Women's Community Correctional Center be a place of healing? Can it be a sanctuary? So when we have that model up, and it talked about the mind, body, spirit, place, it talked about the acronym of SPACE, staff, programs, administration, community, inside and out, and environment. Those are the kinds of elements in which we hope to design the facility in terms of being a Pu'a. Those who we serve at the facility, the question becomes, do you think this is a place of healing? Do you think this is a Pu'a? And it is evidenced by how our staff operates, how our programs operate, how our administration operates, because it is this notion of the modality of punishment versus the modality of change and healing.
Yeah.
But when we talk about this in terms of, even at the federal detention facility and at WCCC, and when we're doing these classes where we're working with staff and we're working with administration, we're working with community inside and out, we try to encourage this common vision and common language. It really is not up to me to say, and even Mark Patterson, when we talk about it, it's not up to me to say this is a place of healing. It really is those that we serve feel, in fact, that this has contributed to my healing journey.
Right.
These circumstances, these programs, and so it's new.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of one of those things that, what? Can prison be a place of healing? What do you mean? And what does that mean? So it's ongoing. It's a wonderful aspiration.
Right, and I think these concepts are radical. I mean, Bob Mercer was our first guest on the show, and he went to Norway, and he brought a bunch of pictures back of the Norwegian prison system, and it's vastly different than our system over here.
Absolutely.
I mean, just to the common areas where they cook, there's knives out in the open, and they're big knives.
Right.
You know, these guys have open areas to play video games in, and the most impressive thing about the Norway system that I thought was the education of the ACOs. They have to go to an academy for 2 years, and before they can actually become a contact officer, they have to actually work in the prison for about 6 months before they get promoted. So you're looking at about 2 years and 6 months of education before you're even allowed to make contact with an offender or a person in jail. And our system right now is kind of just like, as soon as you sign the paperwork for whatever union you're going to belong to, they're going to throw you right in on the front line.
Yeah.
And the education level is really poor. And what I feel like is, instead of educating people on how to deal with what you're saying, trauma-informed care, using social work type, principles to help someone along and get over their issues, it's more of a you bring the big guys in, and if you're causing trouble, you get put into a corner or you get beat down a little bit, and you're just told, just be quiet because you're here to do your time. There's no healing component.
Yeah.
And I think that really needs to be addressed, and I hope that's what we're addressing in these shows. So,
if I just could speak
please.
to a little bit about that, over at the Women's Community Correctional Center, our leadership now is Warden Eric Tanaka, and I do work a lot with administration, and I do work with our ACOs, and our adult correctional officers have a hard job as well. I mean, we work with understanding trauma and how it affects everybody on an individual basis, whether it be our judges, whether it be our ACOs, our administration. There are issues that affect all of us, and it's a health issue that you have to understand. Working with our adult correctional officers, we have some really wonderful, dedicated men and women at WCCC, and we understand that it could be traumatic just taking somebody down, or if there is a response to a suicide attempt where you were the first responder, and then there's blood and there's all kinds of things. These are difficult issues, but I think understanding and being in a context of a place of healing, and then also understanding trauma and how to address it, but also providing the kind of training necessary to provide our people who are at the front line to effectively engage in this in the incarceration and in the prison system. I think we should all, like how they were doing in Norway, really invest in our people.
Yeah, I agree, because it helps them be more informed and brings the safety level of everybody up.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, we'll be right back after these messages with Toni Bissen. My name is Aaron Wills, and this is Rehabilitation Coming Soon.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I host Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com, which streams live educational and civic engagement on the internet and Oceanic Channel 16. I love doing this show because it's an opportunity to be able to share some of the good news as well as the pressing issues for Hawaii and the world about climate change, climate justice, and sustainability, and the need to start employing and continue to request sustainable policy initiatives and actions on the part of our decision makers here and abroad.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, 25 talk shows by 25 dedicated hosts every week, helping us explore and understand the issues and events in and affecting our state. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
Welcome back. I'm Aaron Wills. This is Rehabilitation Coming Soon, and we are discussing the criminal justice system with Toni Bissen. I wanted to start off with our graphic. It's graphic number 9. And there's some background information to it, and I'll just read it here. So across the globe, the 25 jurisdictions with the highest rates of incarcerating women are all American states. Thailand at number 26 is the first non-U.S. government to appear on this high-end list, followed closely at number 27 by the United States itself. The next 17 jurisdictions are also American states. Overall, with the exception of Thailand and the U.S. itself, the top 44 jurisdictions throughout the world with the highest rate of incarcerating women are individual American states. Nearly 30% of the world's incarcerated women are in the United States, twice the percentage as in China and 4 times as much as in Russia. Putting U.S. states in global context is sobering. Even the U.S. states that have comparatively low rates of incarceration far out-incarcerate the majority of the world. Illinois' incarceration rate for women is on par with El Salvador, where abortion is illegal and women are routinely jailed for having miscarriages. New Hampshire is on par with Russia, and New York with Rwanda. Rhode Island, which has the lowest incarceration rate for women in the U.S., would have the 15th highest incarceration rate in the world if it were a country. In other words, only 14 countries incarcerate women at higher rates than Rhode Island, the U.S. state that incarcerates women at the lowest rate of imprisonment. Now, we're outpacing our peers. As we report, the United States incarcerates women at a rate similar only to Thailand. But looking instead to our international peers, exactly how does the U.S. measure up with other nations? For comparison, we use some of our closest allies, the founding countries of the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO. These NATO countries incarcerate women at a rate 8 to 25 times lower than the United States as a whole. As we have noted, Rhode Island has the lowest women's incarceration rate in the U.S., but it still has a rate more than twice that of Portugal, which has the second highest rate of incarcerating women among founding NATO nations. Nationally, the U.S. incarcerates women at a rate 8 times higher than Portugal. So the conclusion: currently, prisons and jails in the U.S. confine approximately 206,000 women at a rate of 127 per 100,000. Within the U.S., it is commonly noted that women are incarcerated far less frequently than men, but comparing women's incarceration rate to that for men paints a falsely optimistic picture. When compared to jurisdictions across the globe, even the U.S. states with the lowest levels of incarceration are far out of line. The statistics revealed by this report are simple and staggering. They suggest that states cannot remain complacent about how many women they incarcerate. Women should be a mainstay of any state policy discussions on the economical and effective use of incarceration if we hope to incarcerate fewer women. One of the major things that we brought up was the cost of incarcerating a women. As we know that the women have a higher rate of being single parents than men do, And so when you incarcerate a woman who happens to be a single parent, you actually incarcerate the kids as well, because they have to be wards of the state into foster care. And so you push up the cost, which the cost for a prisoner is anywhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year. And then the cost to house a child in foster care was somewhere up in the range of about $100,000 and $120,000 a year. So you're looking at anywhere, because if a woman has 3 children, you're looking at anywhere between $400,000 to house 3 children and 1 person in jail or in foster care for a year. And so I just, what can we do differently than what we're doing? And any comments you have about what the graphic we just put up?
Yeah, I think we have one of the graphics that kind of talk a little bit about love breaks chains, and it's a woman and her son. I'm not sure if we have that graphic up, but it really talks about how we can be stronger together than separate. And you're exactly right, Aaron, that when you incarcerate a woman, you incarcerate her family. Yep. And I think when we talk about, it is a public health issue, it is an issue of poverty, it is an issue of family. So we're talking about places and spaces of healing. We're talking about how public, private, faith-based organizations, families, and peers can work together to be part of the solution. If we understand the premise that the pathway to prison is paved with trauma, that was the core initial violence in the home. It was about how to mask that pain, and it's not only for women but men too, and how that pain is masked by drugs, which lead us into the criminal justice system and this notion of mass incarceration at outstanding rates. So it is a complex problem. But the good news is, by understanding trauma, by providing opportunities where our community, that we all can work shoulder to shoulder and make a collective impact, what we talk about Pu'a, can prison be a place of healing, creating places and spaces of healing? Perhaps it's part of the solution in terms of how we as a community can come together and literally work shoulder to shoulder. It is not up to government to really incarcerate and pay for and figure out how we're going to deal with mass incarceration. It is too big of an issue and a social problem. It's going to take all of us. And I just hope that our model and framework and walking shoulder to shoulder with some of our churches, with our families, with our Department of Public Safety, our wardens, that we can bring the kinds of resources to bear that will be part of the solution. So that particular graphic that we had, on the back of it, we're stronger together than separate. There's 2 parts to this graphic, this one and the second page of that. But we utilize this kind of graphic to do the kind of organizing, to provide the kinds of things like transportation, food, clothing, welcome home baskets, housing, employment. And this is something that government doesn't necessarily have all the resources to provide our women and our men who are coming out back into community, welcoming back into the families, that these are the kinds of things that our community can also provide strategically. So again, it's just, I think if we're going to share any kind of message with this issue about mass incarceration, it is one, to understand that perhaps we can look at this issue from a modality of change, transformation, and healing, and not necessarily from a modality of punishment. That we can have the aspiration that these places can be places of healing, and that we can all be part of contributing to the healing journeys that are necessary for those who are currently serving time. And I did reference a pilot study that we did at the Women's Community Correctional Center. That was probably in 2010, 2011. 100% of those that we studied in our pilot demonstration study were confirmed trauma survivors, and to the tune of trauma victims who have experienced trauma from before the age of 10. And so those kinds of experience track how could you do well in school if you can't trust your home environment, that you're being assaulted and you're being a victim of violence? And how are you going to do well in school? How are you going to concentrate? I mean, it's survival. And drug addiction, as everybody will agree, is a tremendous problem. And again, it's how are we going to heal? How can we provide the resources, the necessary resources that we can provide to those that we serve that can be part of the solution, not only because it's going to save money in our community, but it's going to save lives. And we can break the intergenerational curse of the likelihood, if your mother is in prison, your father is in prison, the likelihood of you as the child, 5, 6, 7 times likely, you're going to follow that path. So I guess the good news is that we can be part of a solution. And I guess what Bob folks learned from Norway is that how the society can look and change and embrace those and those who are incarcerated and it being a community.
Well, on the issue of this punish modality that the United States has invested in so deeply, Miles Briner was on the show last week and he brought up this statistic and he said, oh, as you know, the United States is the largest incarcerator of any citizen in the world. So we are the largest incarcerator in the world. Well, CCA happens to be the largest private prison incarcerator in the United States. And they actually incarcerate more people. Since they're the largest in the United States, we're the largest in the world, they're the largest, private corporation incarcerating anybody in the world. So, as you know, there needs to be a new OCCC built, and there's a lot of new upgrades that need to be built here. And it looks like the state is just basically kind of ignoring all of the professionals and what they think should be done, and they might just continue to build another, what we call a silo for warehousing criminals. What's your thoughts on CCA continuing the relationship with the state of Hawaii? And is there a better way or a better route to do this?
Absolutely. The question is great, and everybody has a political answer to it. And I think if we look at it, there is an incentive monetarily to incarcerate people, and it's unfortunate. So as a result, that if there's going to be an incentive, a financial incentive to incarcerate people, you're going to come across a very challenging situation to overcome that. So it's a systems problem. How we're dealing with it in Hawaii, it's a very complex problem. To demonize, the state against us and families and things like that, it really is a hard situation. The conditions at Halava and OCCC are appalling because even on Maui, I mean, there are people who are sleeping on the floor and in very difficult situations because of space. And so when we talk about trying to create a larger space to hold the people who are in the system itself and having a larger space to doing that, and I don't want to oversimplify something, but it is costly to provide more space for what the current problem is. But we're going to have to face some real challenges for cost savings, for saving lives, to do things that we need to do differently. And I think one of the ways that we can do it in Hawaii is because in Hawaii, we do have very close relationships. We're from this community, and so everybody has personal hats, professional hats, organizational hats, and I think we can, in fact, work together to we have to, it's not an option, we have to be able to provide collective impact, we have to have a new normacy, and we have to work together.
All right, well, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to come and inform us of everything, because we need to know this stuff. And so join us next week for another show of Rehabilitation Coming Soon as we continue our discussion of the mass incarceration practices of the United States and the effect of those practices on the state of Hawaii. Stay tuned, because coming up next is Sustainable Hawaii with Kirsten Turner. Thank you.